The wind over the Montana plains didn't just blow, it searched. It searched for the cracks in the window frames of the Vance farmhouse, for the gaps in the barn doors, and for the hollow spaces in a man's chest that grief had left behind. Caleb Vance stood on the porch, his boots coated in the gray dust of a dry March. He was 35, but the lines around his eyes suggested a man who had lived twice, or at least a man who had carried the weight of the world on his shoulders for far too long. In his hand, he held a rusted pair of shears, but his gaze was fixed on the horizon, where the sky was bruising into a deep, unforgiving purple. A storm was coming, another one. Inside the house, there was no music, no laughter. There was only the rhythmic, agonizingly slow ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, a sound that reminded Caleb with every second that he was failing. He was failing the land, failing the legacy of the ranch, and most of all, failing the small, silent boy who sat by the cold kitchen hearth. Noah was 5 years old, but he hadn't spoken a single word since the day they buried his mother under the lone oak tree on the ridge. That was 8 months ago. In that time, the boy had become like a ghost in his own home, moving through the rooms with eyes too large and too old for his face. Caleb wiped a hand across his jaw, feeling the rough stubble. His hands were a laborer's hands, calloused, scarred, and perpetually stained with the grease of machinery and the salt of the earth. He looked at the barn where the roof was sagging under years of neglect. He looked at the empty corrals where 100 head of cattle should have been lowing. The Vance ranch was a shell, and Caleb felt like the wind was slowly blowing what was left of him away. He was about to turn back inside when he saw it. A flash of movement at the end of the long gravel driveway. A lone figure walking. No one walked out here. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and the town of Oakhaven was 10. The figure moved with a steady, purposeful gait, despite the wind whipping at a long coat. As the person drew closer, Caleb realized it was a woman. She carried a single suitcase and wore a scarf wrapped tightly around her head. Caleb's grip tightened on the shears. He didn't want visitors. He didn't want pity, and he certainly didn't have any work to offer. But the woman didn't stop at the gate. She walked right up to the porch steps, her boots clicking on the wood. She stopped 3 steps below him. When she looked up, the wind caught a stray strand of auburn hair, tucking it across a face that looked tired, but remarkably steady. Her eyes were a warm, mossy green, the kind of green you only saw in the creek beds after a long winter. Mr. Vance, her voice was low, melodic, and held a strange resonance that made the hair on Caleb's arm stand up. "The ranch is closed," Caleb said, his voice gravelly from hours of silence. "If you're looking for the highway, you took a wrong turn 5 miles back." The woman didn't flinch. She set her suitcase down and looked past him toward the darkened windows of the house. "I'm not lost, Caleb, and I'm not looking for the highway." Caleb froze. She had used his first name, not Grace or Sir, but Caleb. There was a familiarity in her tone that felt like a phantom limb, something he didn't realize was missing until it was touched. "Do I know you?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. "You knew a girl with flour on her hands in a shop that smelled of chamomile," she said softly. "But that was a lifetime ago, before you went to the war, before you became the man who forgot how to keep his own house warm." Caleb felt a jolt in his chest, a sharp electric pain. Memory was a dangerous thing on a ranch this lonely. It brought back the smell of wood smoke and the taste of tea without sugar. It brought back a night 7 years ago, when he was nothing but a rejected stable boy with a gash over his eye and nowhere to go. "Abigail," he whispered the name, tasting like ash and honey. "I heard about your wife, Caleb," she said, stepping up onto the porch. She didn't wait for an invitation. She walked toward the front door, her presence bringing a scent of crushed herbs and rain into the stale air of his life. "And I heard about Noah. A house this quiet isn't a home. It's a grave. And I didn't come all this way to let you bury yourself in it." She reached for the door handle, but Caleb stepped in front of her. "You can't just walk in here, Abby. 7 years. You disappeared. I sent letters that never got answered. I came back from overseas to a shop that was boarded up." "I had my own storms to survive, Caleb," she replied, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of the same grief he carried in her eyes. "But I'm here now. I have nowhere else to go, and you have a son who has forgotten the sound of his own name. We can argue about the past when the stove is lit and the boy has been fed. Until then, get my suitcase. It's going to snow before sunset." Caleb watched her walk into his kitchen. He stood on the porch for a long minute, the shears heavy in his hand.
The wind screamed across the plains, but for the first time in 8 months, it wasn't the only sound in the air.
Inside, he heard the heavy iron lid of the wood stove being lifted. He heard the scrape of a match, and then he heard something that made his heart stop. It was a soft rhythmic humming. Noah, who had been sitting motionless by the hearth, had turned his head. The boy wasn't looking at the floor anymore. He was looking at the woman who was kneeling in the dust, blowing on a small flame, until the wood caught and the first glow of warmth began to creep across the cold stone floor. Caleb picked up the suitcase. It was heavier than it looked, filled with the tools of a healer. Blue glass jars, dried bundles of comfrey, and a small locked tin box. As he stepped over the threshold, the house felt different. It was still sagging, still dusty, and still haunted by the woman who was gone. But as the smell of cedar smoke began to fill the room, Caleb looked at Abigail's silhouette against the firelight and felt the first terrifying crack in the ice around his soul. The stable boy had come home long ago, but the woman who had saved him was only just beginning her work. The interior of the Vance farmhouse was a landscape of gray. Gray dust on the mantel, gray shadows in the corners, and the gray hollow silence of a place where life had stalled. But as Abby knelt before the stove, the first sparks of orange began to eat away at the gloom. Caleb stood in the doorway, his large frame nearly blocking the light from the hallway. He watched her with a mixture of suspicion and a deep, aching curiosity. She moved with a strange muscle memory, efficiency reaching for the iron poker in the wood box as if she hadn't been gone a day. "The flour is in the pantry," she said without looking back. "The third ceramic jar on the left, unless you moved it." Caleb didn't move for a long beat. "I haven't opened that jar since August." "Then it's likely turned to stone, but we'll see." She stood up, dusting soot from her palms. Her gaze fell on Noah. The boy was still staring at her, his small fingers curled into the hem of his oversized flannel shirt. He looked like a bird that wanted to fly but had forgotten how to use its wings. Abby didn't approach him directly. She knew better. A frightened child was like a wild colt. If you cornered them, they'd only retreat further into the brush. Instead, she walked to the sink and pumped the handle until cold, clear water splashed into a rusted basin. "Caleb the boy is thin," she said, her voice dropping an octave. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation of a healer. "When was the last time he had something other than canned beans and dry biscuits?" Caleb felt a hot flush of shame creep up his neck. "I do what I can. I'm out in the fields from dawn till dark. The fences don't fix themselves, and the pump has been acting up. I don't have time for fancy meals." "A hot soup isn't fancy, Caleb. It's a requirement." Abby moved to the pantry. She found the jar exactly where she said it would be. She pulled out a small, blue-wrapped bundle from her own suitcase, a piece of dried beef and a handful of withered but fragrant herbs she'd carried through the storm. For the next hour, the only sounds in the kitchen were the bubbling of a pot and the soft clatter of Abby's work. She didn't ask Caleb for help. She didn't ask him where the spoons were. She simply existed in the space, reclaiming it inch by inch from the dust. Caleb sat at the heavy oak table, the wood scarred by generations of Vance men. He watched her back as she stirred the pot, the steam rising around her like a veil. 7 years ago, he would have given anything to see this sight. He had been a different man then, stronger perhaps, but certainly more hopeful. He was the boy from the stables who had fallen for the girl who lived above the apothecary shop in town. He remembered the way she'd look at him when he brought the horses around, a look that said she saw more than just a laborer. But then came the letters from overseas, the ones he wrote while huddled in trenches dreaming of Montana grass. And then came the silence. "Why didn't you write back?" The question escaped him before he could stop it. It was a raw, jagged sound in the quiet room. Abby's hand stilled on the wooden spoon. She didn't turn around. "I did write, Caleb. I wrote every Sunday for a year. I told you about my Uncle Silas falling ill. I told you the shop was struggling. I told you I was waiting." "I never got them," Caleb said, his voice straining. "I waited at the mail call every week. Nothing. I thought you'd moved on. I thought you'd found a man who didn't smell like horse manure and wet hay." Abby turned, then her face illuminated by the amber glow of the stove. "The mail during the war was a ghost, Caleb. But I didn't move on. I waited until the bank took the shop. I waited until I had nothing left but a suitcase and the memory of a boy who promised he'd come back for me. By the time you did come back, I was gone. I had to find work in the city. I had to survive." She took a breath, her green eyes shimmering with a sudden sharp intensity. And then I heard you'd married Sarah. I heard you had a son. I thought you were the one who had forgotten." Caleb looked down at his scarred knuckles. Sarah had been a good woman, a steady, hard-working neighbor who had stepped into the void of his loneliness. He had loved her in the way a man loves a partner in a hard life, but it had never been the lightning strike fire he'd felt with Abby. Now Sarah was gone, and the woman from his youth was standing in his kitchen, smelling of the herbs that used to cure his every ache. A small sound broke the tension, a tiny muffled sniffle. They both looked toward the hearth. Noah had moved. He was no longer curled in a ball. He was leaning forward, his nose twitching at the scent of the soup. Abby grabbed a cracked ceramic bowl, Sarah's favorite, and filled it with a golden steaming broth. She didn't bring it to the table. Instead, she sat on the floor 3 feet away from the boy. She set the bowl on the rug between them and blew on a spoonful of her own.
It's a bit salty, she murmured to the air. My uncle always said I had a heavy hand with the sea salt, but the wild onion helps.
Noah watched her. His eyes traveled from the bowl to her face, then back to the bowl. Very slowly, like a creature emerging from a burrow, he crawled forward. He reached out a small, trembling hand and touched the edge of the bowl.
Caleb held his breath. He felt like his heart was lodged in his throat. In 8 months, Noah hadn't touched anything Caleb had cooked it with interest. He ate only because he had to.
Noah picked up the spoon. He took a small sip, then another. Then he looked up at Abby and did something he hadn't done since the funeral. He reached out and touched the sleeve of her coat. It was a tiny gesture, a child reaching for a stranger, but to Caleb it felt like a thunderclap. The boy wasn't pulling away. He was seeking. Abby didn't move. She didn't try to hug him or overwhelm him with affection. She simply sat there, letting the boy anchor himself to her. "You have your father's eyes," she whispered so softly, Caleb almost missed it. "But you have a gentler spirit, I think." Noah didn't speak, but he didn't let go of her sleeve. He finished the bowl, his small face losing some of its pinched gray pallor. Caleb watched them, and a terrifying thought took root in his mind. He had spent months trying to protect Noah from the world, trying to build a wall of silence around their grief so that nothing else could hurt them. But looking at them now, he realized that he hadn't been protecting the boy at all. He had been suffocating him. "Abby," Caleb said, his voice thick. "Don't," she said, looking over her shoulder. "Don't say thank you. And don't ask me how long I'm staying. The storm is hitting the glass and the wood box is empty. If you want us to survive the night, you'd better get to the barn and bring in the rest of the cedar."
Caleb stood up. He felt a sudden surge of energy, a purpose that went beyond just keeping the ranch from falling down. He grabbed his heavy coat from the hook by the door. "The guest room is at the top of the stairs," he said. "The blankets are in the cedar chest. They might smell of mothballs, but they're wool."
"I've slept on straw and stone, Caleb Vance," she replied, her attention returning to Noah, who was now leaning his head against her shoulder. "I think I can manage a cedar chest." As Caleb stepped out onto the porch, the wind hit him with the force of a physical blow. The snow was coming down in thick, blinding sheets, turning the ranch into a white void. But as he fought his way toward the barn, his eyes kept drifting back to the kitchen window. The light inside was warm, it was steady, and for the first time in a very long time, it didn't look like a candle flickering out in the dark. It looked like a beacon. He didn't know why she had come or what secret she was hiding in that locked tin box. But as he threw open the barn doors to check on the shivering horses, Caleb realized that the silence of the Vance ranch had finally been broken. And he wasn't sure if he was more relieved or more afraid of what would happen when the secrets finally came to light. The storm didn't just bring snow. It brought a heavy, suffocating isolation that forced the three souls inside the Vance farmhouse to look at one another. While the wind rattled the window panes like a debt collector at the door, the kitchen became a sanctuary of yellow lamplight and the scent of simmering cedar and wild mint.
Caleb sat by the hearth cleaning a leather harness he had ignored for months. His hands moved with a mechanical rhythm, but his eyes kept drifting to Abby. She was sitting at the table, with Noah teaching the boy how to sort dried lavender buds from their stems. It was a task that required patience and soft touch, and for the first time, Noah's hands weren't shaking.
"You haven't changed the way you sort those," Caleb said, his voice cutting through the quiet. "You always did the lavender first because you said it made your dreams smell like summer." Abby looked up, a small, sad smile playing on her lips. "And you always remembered the smallest things, Caleb. Even when you were just a boy in my father's stables hiding from the rain and pretending you were only there to check the horses' shoes." Noah looked from one to the other, his wide eyes capturing the unspoken history hanging in the air. Is that where you met? The boy's voice was a tiny, fragile rasp. It was only a few words, but it made Caleb's heart hammer against his ribs. It was the first question Noah had asked in nearly a year. Abby reached out and gently brushed the stray hair from Noah's forehead. Yes, little one. Your father was the hardest working boy in the county. He had a way with the horses that no one else had. He could calm a panicked stallion with just a whistle. And I was just the girl who brought him apples and stole his hats. Caleb looked away, the memory hitting him with visceral force. He remembered the feeling of being 18, dirt under his fingernails, and a heart full of impossible dreams. He had been a nobody, a stable boy with no land and no name. Abby's father, a proud man who owned the town's apothecary, had seen Caleb as a useful hand, but never as a suitor for his only daughter. He kicked me out, Noah, Caleb said, his voice rough. The day I asked for his blessing to marry your Aunt Abby, he told me I was nothing but a stray dog. He said a man without land was a man without a soul. So I left. I went to the army to earn enough to buy this ranch, to prove I was more than a stable boy. And you did, Abby added softly. But the cost was high, wasn't it? Caleb looked at the sagging ceiling. Too high. By the time I came back with enough gold for the down payment, your father was gone, the shop was closed, and you were a ghost. I bought this land because it was the only thing I had left to prove. I married your mother because she was lonely and I was empty, and we both knew how to work the dirt. We were good partners, Noah. We built this place together. But a ranch built on pride and grief, it doesn't hold up well against the wind. The honesty in the room was as sharp as the cold outside. Caleb realized he had never spoken these truths to anyone, not even to Sarah. He had kept his past locked in the same dark cellar as his grief. The moment was shattered by a heavy thud against the front door. Not the wind, a fist.
Caleb was on his feet in a second, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle, leaning against the wall. He signaled for Abby to take Noah into the back room. She didn't argue. She gathered the boy and vanished into the shadows of the hallway. Caleb pulled open the door. The snow swirled into the entryway, stinging his face. Standing on the porch was a man in a thick fur coat, flanked by two younger men who looked like they enjoyed breaking things. Caleb recognized the man immediately, Silas Howland's lawyer, but he wasn't here for law. He was here for Mrs. Farley.
Vance, the man sneered, his breath hitching in the cold. A bit late for a social call, but the bank doesn't sleep just because it's snowing. I have the updated assessment for the North Pasture. The North Pasture isn't for sale, Miller, Caleb growled. I told you last month. My taxes are paid up through June. Paid with what hopes? Miller stepped into the entryway uninvited. He shook the snow from his hat, his eyes scanning the room with a predator's greed. Mrs. Farley is concerned about the stability of this environment for a minor child. She's filed a petition. She claims that without a mother in the house and with the ranch falling into disrepair, Noah would be better served under her guardianship at the Farley estate.
Caleb's vision went red. The Farley estate was a cold, grand house built on the misery of others. Mrs. Farley was Sarah's distant aunt, a woman who had never stepped foot on the ranch while Sarah was alive, but had been circling like a vulture ever since the funeral. She didn't want Noah. She wanted the mineral rights that had recently been discovered near the creek.
Get out, Caleb said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration.
The court hearing is in 2 weeks, Caleb. Unless, of course, you can prove this house is no longer neglected. But look at this place. It's a tomb. Miller's eyes suddenly caught something on the table. The lavender buds, the 2 tea mugs, the smell of fresh soup. His eyes shifted to the hallway where Abby stood in the shadows.
Well, well, Miller smiled, and it was a cold, oily thing. I didn't know you'd hired help, or is this just a drifter you've taken in? That won't look good for the guardianship papers, Vance. Bringing a strange woman into a house with a grieving child. I'm not a stranger, Abby's voice rang out from the darkness. She stepped into the light, her chin held high. My name is Abigail Rhodes. I'm a licensed apothecary and a family friend. And if you don't step out of this house in the next 10 seconds, I'll be filing my own report about the harassment of a family in the middle of a state-declared storm. Miller blinked, taken aback by her steel. He looked at Caleb, then back at Abby. Rhodes, the apothecary's daughter, I thought you died in the city. I'm very much alive, she said, walking up to Caleb's side. She didn't touch him, but he felt the heat of her presence like a shield. And I'm staying, so you can tell Mrs. Farley that the Vance ranch is no longer empty. Miller narrowed his eyes. We'll see what the judge says about old friends moving in after dark. Enjoy the snow, Vance. It's going to be a long winter. He slammed the door behind him. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of grief, it was the silence of a looming war. Caleb leaned his forehead against the door, his heart racing. He had almost lost his temper. He had almost lost everything.
They want the land, don't they? Abby asked quietly.
They want the creek, Caleb replied, but they'll take Noah to get it. They know I can't fight a legal battle and run the ranch at the same time. I'm drowning, Abby. I've been drowning for months. You aren't alone anymore, she said. Caleb turned to look at her. She looked so small against the backdrop of the darkened house, yet she was the only thing standing between him and total ruin. You can't stay for this, Abby. Mrs. Farley will drag your name through the mud. She'll call you a woman of no virtue for staying here with a widower. This town, it hasn't changed. They'll eat you alive. Abby walked over to the table and picked up the small, locked tin box she had brought with her. She set it in Caleb's hand. Do you know what's in here, Caleb?
No, the silver half sovereign you left on my father's counter the night you ran away. You thought you were paying for the medicine and the shirt I gave you, but I never spent it. I kept it as a promise that one day the boy who cared for horses would come back for the girl who cared for him.
She looked up at him, her eyes fierce. I've already lost 7 years to silence and pride. I'm not losing another day. Let them talk. Let them sue. We have a ranch to save and a boy who needs to hear his father laugh again. Are you going to keep cleaning that harness, or are we going to get to work? Caleb looked at the tin box in his palm, then at the woman who had returned from the dead to save his life a second time. We get to work, he said. Outside, the storm shrieked, but inside the kitchen, the hearth was roaring. The warning from Miller hadn't been a bluff. By the following Tuesday, the purple bruises on the horizon had turned into a suffocating black shroud. The temperature plummeted so fast that the sap in the old oaks groaned and cracked like rifle shots. This wasn't just a spring snow, it was a late season blizzard, the kind that killed livestock and broke the spirits of even the toughest ranchers.
Caleb was a shadow in the storm. He spent 18 hours a day fighting the wind, his face cracked and bleeding from the ice crystals. He moved the remaining cattle into the lower barn, hulling them together for warmth, and spent his nights hauling heavy buckets of unfrozen water from the house to the troughs. He was exhausted, his body screaming for sleep, but every time he looked toward the farmhouse window, he saw a flicker of yellow light.
Abby was the keeper of that light. Inside, she had transformed the kitchen into a makeshift infirmary. She had moved Noah's bed closer to the wood stove, wrapping him in every wool blanket she could find. But the stress of the lawyer's visit and the howling wind had taken a toll on the boy. Noah had developed a fever, a hot, dry heat that made his breath come in shallow, terrifying rasps.
Caleb, Abby's voice cut through the roar of the wind as he stumbled onto the porch late that evening, caked in white.
He slammed the door shut, leaning his weight against it as if the storm were a physical beast trying to claw its way in. He was shivering violently, his fingers too numb to unbutton his coat. Abby was at his side in an instant. She didn't waste time with words. She peeled the frozen canvas from his shoulders and guided him toward the fire. The boy, Caleb managed to croak through blue lips. The fever is holding, but he's struggling, she said, her hands moving over him with professional calm. She pressed a mug of steaming liquid into his hands. It wasn't coffee, but a bitter, pungent brew of willow bark and honey. Drink all of it. I need you on your feet, Caleb. I can't do this alone.
Caleb drank the heat of the tea radiating through his chest like a slow burning fuse. He looked at Noah, whose small face was flushed dark red against the white pillowcase. If he gets worse, we can't get to town, Caleb whispered, the fear finally breaking through his stoicism. The drifts are 6 feet deep at the gate. No horse can make it through that.
Then we don't go to town, Abby replied, her voice steady. We bring the medicine from the land. I have the tincture I made from the North Creek roots before the freeze, but I need more cedar oil for his chest, and I use the last of it on the lamps. I'll get it, Caleb said, starting to rise. No, she caught his arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. You've given everything you have to the barn tonight. Sit, eat. If you collapse, none of us survive. I'll go to the wood shop. It's 50 yards in total darkness, Abby. You'll lose the path.
I followed your heart for 7 years across 3 states, Caleb Vance. I think I can find a wood shop in the dark.
The tension between them was no longer just about the past or the ranch. It was about the raw, visceral need to keep a family whole. Caleb watched her pull on her heavy shawl, her silhouette sharp against the firelight. In that moment, she didn't look like an intruder or an old flame. She looked like the backbone of his life. Wait, Caleb said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a length of heavy twine. He tied one end to the door handle and handed the other to her. Don't let go of this. Not for a second. She nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of the danger, and stepped out into the white void. The 30 minutes she was gone were the longest of Caleb's life. He sat by Noah's side, rubbing the boy's cold feet and watching the twine hum in the wind. Every jerk of the string was a heartbeat. He realized then that if that string snapped, his world would end. Not because of the land or the debts, but because the woman on the other end of that rope was the only thing that made the Vance Ranch feel like a home instead of a prison. When the door finally blew open again, Abby was a ghost of ice. She was clutching a small jar of oil, her face white, and her breath coming in gasps. Caleb hauled her in, slamming the door and catching her before she hit the floor.
He didn't think. He didn't hesitate. He pulled her into his arms, wrapping his heavy coat around both of them, his heat bleeding into her frozen skin. For a moment, the only sound was their labored breathing and the crackle of the fire.
I have it, she whispered into his chest. I have it, Caleb.
You're a fool, Abigail Rhodes, he murmured, his face buried in the wet wool of her hair. A stubborn, beautiful fool.
She pulled back just enough to look at him, her green eyes fierce, even in her exhaustion. And you're a man who thinks he has to carry the storm on his back. You don't. You have me. Say it. Caleb looked at her, and the words he had buried for 7 years, the words he hadn't even said to the wife he had buried, rose to the surface. I have you. They worked through the night, a silent, synchronized team. Caleb kept the fire roaring while Abby massaged the oil into Noah's chest, the scent of cedar filling the room. They didn't speak of the lawyer or the bank or the ghost of Sarah. They spoke through the passing of towels, the sharing of water, and the quiet, steady gazes they exchanged over the sleeping boy. As the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the frost on the windows, the wind finally began to die down. The silence that followed wasn't the heavy, dead silence of before. It was a peaceful, exhausted quiet. Noah's fever broke at 5:00 a.m. The boy opened his eyes, the glassy shimmer gone. He looked at Abby, who was slumped in the chair beside him, her head resting on her hand. Then he looked at Caleb, who was sitting on the floor at the foot of the bed. Noah reached out a small hand and touched Abby's hair.
Abby, he whispered.
She woke instantly, her eyes snapping to the boy. I'm here, Noah. I'm right here.
The storm, is it gone?
The worst of it is, she said, her voice thick with emotion. She looked at Caleb, a message passing between them that needed no words. Dad, Noah turned his gaze to Caleb.
Caleb moved to the side of the bed, his large hand trembling as he took Noah's small one. I'm here, son.
Don't let her go, Noah said, his voice small but clear. Don't let the wind take her away.
Caleb felt a tear slip down his weathered cheek, the first one in years. He looked at Abby, who was watching him with a hope so raw it was painful.
I won't, Noah, Caleb said, his voice a vow that echoed through the kitchen. I won't let the wind take anything ever again. But as he looked out at the snow-covered ranch, Caleb knew the battle wasn't over. The storm of nature had passed, but the storm of men was coming. Mrs. Farley would be back, and she would bring the law with her. He looked at the small green bag Abby had brought, and then at the scarred oak table. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't just survive anymore. He had to fight, and for the first time, he knew exactly what he was fighting for. The week following the great blizzard was a symphony of dripping eaves and the smell of wet waking earth. The snow didn't just melt. It retreated, uncovering a ranch that looked like a battlefield. Fences were down, the north paddock was a sea of mud, and the old equipment was half buried in debris. But inside the farmhouse, the gray ghost of silence had been exorcised. It started in the kitchen. Abby had spent the days when Caleb was out fixing the fences, scrubbing every inch of the oak floor. She had polished the copper pots until they caught the morning sun, and she had sewn new simple curtains from a bolt of gingham she found in Sarah's old sewing chest. She didn't ask permission to change the house. She simply understood that a home needed to be lived in to be saved. Noah was no longer a shadow. He followed Abby like a small, determined apprentice. He helped her grind dried herbs for her tinctures, his small hands moving with a focus that made Caleb stop in the doorway just to watch. For the first time in his life, Caleb saw his son looking at the future instead of the floor. One afternoon, Caleb came in from the barn, his shirt soaked with sweat and his back aching from hauling fence posts. He found the kitchen table covered in jars and small blue bottles. The air smelled of peppermint pine and something warm and sweet blackberry cobbler. Abby was leaning over the table writing in a leather-bound ledger. She looked up as he entered, her hair damp from the steam of the stove.
The kitchen isn't an infirmary anymore, Abby, Caleb said, though there was no bite in his words. He pulled off his muddy boots and sat at the bench, letting out a long, weary sigh. It's an apothecary, Caleb, she corrected him, sliding a mug of cider toward him. I've been into town while you were at the creek. Word got out that the Rhodes girl was back. Mrs. Gable has the croup, and the Miller twins have developed a rash. I've sold 10 tinctures in 3 days. Caleb looked at the silver coins neatly stacked on the corner of the table. You're earning more than the cattle would have brought in 6 months.
It's a start, she said. She walked over to him, her hand resting naturally on his shoulder. It was a gesture of such domestic ease that it made Caleb's breath hitch. It's enough to pay the back taxes on the north pasture. I've already sent the draft to the bank. Caleb caught her hand, his rough thumb tracing the lines of her palm. I didn't ask you to pay my debts, Abby. They aren't your debts, Caleb. They're ours, unless you're still planning on walking me to the end of the driveway when the mud dries. Caleb pulled her closer, his forehead resting against her apron. I don't think the boy would let you get past the gate, and neither would I. The warmth of the moment was interrupted by the sound of a truck engine, a rare and unwelcome sound on the Vance ranch. Caleb was on his feet instantly, his hand reaching for the hat he'd just set down.
Through the window, they saw a black polished car pulling up to the porch. It looked out of place against the weathered wood and the mud caked yard. A woman stepped out, dressed in a black silk suit and a hat that cost more than Caleb's tractor.
Mrs. Serena Farley. She didn't wait to be greeted. She walked onto the porch with the air of a queen visiting a slum. Behind her followed Miller, the lawyer looking significantly less confident than he had during the storm. Caleb opened the door before they could knock. He stood on the threshold, his frame filling the space a silent wall of Montana muscle. Mrs. Farley, he said, his voice flat. Caleb, she replied, her eyes sweeping over the porch and landing on the new gingham curtains in the window. Her lip curled. I see you've made some cosmetic changes. I suppose it's easier to hang curtains than it is to provide a stable future for a child. Noah is doing fine, Caleb growled. The fever is gone and he's eating better than he has in a year. You can leave the way you came. I'm afraid it's not that simple, she said, stepping forward. The court hearing has been moved up to Friday. I've filed an emergency injunction. Miller has discovered that the deed to this ranch, the one your father left you, contains a specific clause regarding the moral and social standing of the head of the household. It's an old homestead law, rarely used, but quite effective. She looked past him to Abby, who was standing in the kitchen doorway, her hand on Noah's shoulder. Bringing a woman of unknown reputation into a house with a grieving boy without the benefit of marriage and allowing her to run a business from your kitchen? The judge will find it highly irregular, Caleb. At best, it shows a lack of judgment. At worst, it shows a disregard for Sarah's memory and the boy's welfare.
Caleb felt the anger rising like a tide, but before he could speak, Abby stepped forward. She walked right up to the screen door, her eyes meeting Mrs. Farley's with a cold, piercing clarity. You speak of reputation, Mrs. Farley, Abby said, her voice echoing in the quiet afternoon. But perhaps we should speak of the $5,000 you've been funneling out of Sarah's estate into your own failing development project in town. I've seen the ledgers. Sarah kept a record of everything you managed for her while Caleb was overseas.
Mrs. Farley's face went pale, the rouge on her cheeks standing out like bruises. That's a lie. Sarah was a simple woman. She didn't know anything about finance. She was a rancher's wife, Abby replied. She knew exactly what a dollar was worth, and she knew you were stealing from Noah's future. Caleb might not have seen it because he was too busy surviving, but I've spent the last 3 days going through the boxes in the attic. Sarah didn't trust you, Serena, and she left the proof in a tin box under the floorboards of the schoolhouse porch.
Caleb looked at Abby stunned. He hadn't known about the boxes or the money. He had been so blinded by his own grief that he hadn't seen the betrayal happening right under his nose.
You have no standing in this court, Miller stammered, his oily voice shaking. You're a stranger, a nobody. I am the woman who saved the man who owns this land, Abby said. And I am the woman who is going to make sure that Noah Vance never has to step foot in your house. Now get off this porch before I call the sheriff and hand him the documents Sarah left behind. Mrs. Farley looked at Caleb, searching for the broken man she had seen at the funeral. But she didn't find him. She found a man who had rediscovered his fire. This isn't over, Caleb, she hissed. A few old papers won't save you from a judge's decree.
Maybe not, Caleb said, his voice a low thunder. But they'll sure as hell sink you. Get off my land.
He watched them scramble back into the car, the tires spinning in the mud. As the car vanished down the driveway, the adrenaline that had been keeping Caleb upright began to fade, leaving him trembling. Abby turned to him, her face soft once more. I'm sorry, Caleb. I didn't want to tell you about the money that way. I wanted to be sure first. Caleb didn't answer with words. He reached out and pulled her into a fierce, desperate embrace. He held her so tight he could feel her heartbeat against his own. How did you find it? He whispered. Noah showed me, she said, looking toward the boy. He told me Mama used to hide treasure at the schoolhouse when the mean lady came to visit. He took me there yesterday while you were fixing the pump. Caleb looked at his son. Noah was standing by the stove, a small, knowing smile on his face. The boy hadn't just spoken, he had saved them. He had been the one holding the key to their survival all along. Friday is the hearing, Caleb said, pulling back to look at Abby. They'll try to say you shouldn't be here. They'll try to use our past against us. Let them, Abby said, her moss-green eyes shining with a fierce light. I've waited 7 years to stand by your side, Caleb Vance. A judge in a black robe isn't going to stop me now. As the sun began to set over the Montana plains, casting long golden shadows across the porch, the Vance Ranch felt like it was finally holding its breath. Not in fear, but in preparation. The hearth was warm, the boy was safe, and for the first time, Caleb Vance wasn't just a widowed rancher. He was a man with a home to fight for. The Oak Haven Courthouse was a red brick building that stood at the center of town like a stern grandmother watching over a rowdy family. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old paper floor wax and the nervous sweat of people whose lives were about to be decided by a man in a black robe.
Caleb sat at the oak table, his suit feeling too tight across his broad shoulders. He felt out of place here. He was a man of the open range of wind and dirt, not of gavels and legal precedents. Noah sat between him and Abby, swinging his legs nervously, his small hand tucked firmly under Abby's arm.
Across the aisle, Serena Farley sat like a statue of ice. She didn't look at him. She whispered constantly to Miller, whose face was a mask of professional arrogance, though Caleb noticed the way the lawyer's pen trembled as he organized his papers. Judge Higgins, a man whose face looked like a topographic map of Montana's Badlands, took his seat. He looked at the petition for guardianship, then at the 3 people sitting at the Vance table. Mr. Miller, the judge began, his voice a dry rasp. You claim that the Vance Ranch is an unfit environment for a minor child. You cite neglect of the property, financial instability, and the presence of an unauthorized individual in the household. Proceed. Miller stood up, his voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room. He spoke of the sagging barn, the missed tax deadlines, and the moral ambiguity of Abigail Rhodes, living under the same roof as a widower. He painted a picture of a broken man dragging a child down into a pit of despair.
Mr. Vance has no plan, Your Honor, Miller concluded, leaning into the bench. He has no partner, no financial security, and a history of silence that suggests he is mentally incapable of raising a traumatized boy. Mrs. Farley, a blood relative, offers a home with every advantage. Caleb's knuckles turned white. He started to rise, his jaw set, but Abby's hand on his arm was like a lead weight. Asterisk wait. Asterisk, her eyes said. Your Honor, Abby said, standing up. She didn't wait to be called. She moved to the center of the room with a grace that silenced the whispering gallery. I am Abigail Rhodes, and if we are talking about plans and stability, perhaps we should look at the financial records Miller has conveniently omitted.
She walked to the bench and placed a small stack of papers in front of the judge.
These are the tax receipts for the Vance Ranch paid in full 3 days ago, she said. And these are the ledgers from the Vance estate accounts from the time Caleb Vance was serving overseas. They show a systematic withdrawal of funds, nearly $6,000, signed by Serena Farley under the guise of management fees, funds that were meant for Noah's education and the ranch's upkeep.
A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Serena Farley stood up, her face twisting into a mask of outrage. That's a fabrication. Those records were private. They were in Sarah's sewing chest, Serena, Abby said, turning to face her. She didn't trust you. She knew you were bleeding the ranch dry while Caleb was fighting for this country. She kept every receipt, every letter of intent you sent her, and she hid them where she knew only someone who truly loved her family would find them. Judge Higgins spent a long, agonizing minute looking through the papers. The silence in the room was so absolute you could hear the ticking of the clock on the back wall. Mrs. Farley, the judge said, his voice dropping an octave, these signatures match the ones on your petition. Can you explain why management fees for a failing ranch would include the purchase of a luxury vehicle and a down payment on a condominium in the city? Serena Farley opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked at Miller, but the lawyer was busy looking at his own shoes. But that's only the financial matter, the judge continued looking at Abby. The question of the child's welfare remains. Miss Rhodes, you are not a relative. You have no legal standing in this house. The law is quite clear about the presence of unrelated females in a household with a minor.
Caleb stood up then. He didn't look at the judge. He looked at Abby. He saw the woman who had nursed his fever 7 years ago. He saw the woman who had walked through a blizzard to save his son. He saw the only home he had ever really known.
She's not an unrelated female, Your Honor. Caleb's voice was like a hammer striking an anvil. It filled every corner of the room. She's the heartbeat of that ranch. And if the law says she has no standing, then I'll change the law. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small silver half sovereign from 1807. He stepped toward Abby and took her hand, placing the coin in her palm before the entire town. I gave her this coin 7 years ago as a debt, Caleb said, his eyes never leaving hers. I didn't know then that it was a down payment on a life, but I know it now. Abigail Rhodes isn't help. She's my partner. She's my future. And if you'll have me, Abby, she's going to be my wife. The room exploded into a cacophony of murmurs. Noah stood up on his chair and shouted, "She's already my Abby." Judge Higgins banged his gavel, but he couldn't hide the small, rare twitch of a smile at the corner of his mouth. Order, order in this court, the judge roared. He waited until the room settled before looking at Serena Farley. Mrs. Farley, your petition for guardianship is denied. Furthermore, I am referring these financial records to the district attorney for a full audit of your estate management. I suggest you find a very good lawyer, one who isn't Mr. Miller. Serena Farley slumped into her chair, the ice finally shattered. She looked small, old, and defeated. The judge turned back to Caleb and Abby. Mr. Vance, I've known you since you were a boy in the stables. You were always a man of few words. It's good to see you finally found the ones that matter. He closed the file with a definitive thud. This court is adjourned. Go home, Caleb, and take your family with you. The walk out of the courthouse was a blur. People Caleb hadn't spoken to in years reached out to shake his hand. Women from the town who had ignored Abby for weeks were suddenly nodding in respect. But Caleb didn't stop to talk. He led Abby and Noah straight to the weathered truck. They didn't speak until they were miles out of town, the gravel crunching under the tires as they turned onto the ranch road. The sunset was painting the big sky in shades of gold and fire reflecting off the windows of the farmhouse. Caleb pulled the truck to a stop at the gate, the same gate where Abby had arrived in the storm. He turned off the engine, and for a moment the only sound was the ticking of the cooling metal.
You meant it, Abby asked, her voice trembling. In the courtroom about the marriage. Caleb reached over and took her hand, his thumb tracing the coin she was still clutching. I've meant it for 7 years, Abby. I just didn't think I was a man who deserved a second chance. I thought I was meant to stay in the gray.
He looked at Noah, who had fallen asleep against the window, a look of utter peace on his face. I was a broken cowboy on a failing ranch, Caleb said. But you didn't see the broken parts. You saw the home that was still there, hiding under the dust. You healed my son Abby. You healed me. If you'll stay, if you'll marry me, I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to walk a storm alone again. Abby leaned over and kissed him, a quiet, deep and steady kiss that tasted of salt and the promise of a long, warm summer.
I'm already home, Caleb, she whispered. I'm already home.
June in Montana didn't just bring the heat. It brought a riot of life. The Vance Ranch, which had been a landscape of gray and silence only months before, was now a tapestry of emerald green pastures, golden wheat, and the vibrant, sweet-smelling blossoms of wild clover. The barn had been repaired, its red paint bright against the blue sky. The fences were straight and strong, and the north paddock was once again filled with the steady, comforting sound of cattle lowing in the twilight. But the real transformation was the house itself. The porch no longer creaked with neglect. It groaned with the weight of flower boxes and the laughter of a boy who had rediscovered his voice. It was the morning of the wedding, but there was no grand cathedral or expensive reception. Caleb and Abby had chosen the front porch of the farmhouse, the place where their second chance had begun.
Caleb stood by the railing, his boots polished and his best black vest pulled tight. He looked out over the land, feeling a sense of peace that he hadn't known since he was a boy in the stables. The ranch was no longer a burden. It was a living, breathing testament to resilience.
Silas Howland, Abby's uncle, sat in a rocking chair nearby, his gouty leg propped up, but a wide, toothless grin on his face. He had arrived from town the day before, clutching a box of old apothecary bottles and a bottle of fine whiskey he'd been saving for a miracle. "You did it, Caleb," Silas croaked, gesturing to the rolling hills. "You kept the land, and you kept the heart of it." Caleb nodded slowly. "I didn't do it alone, Silas. I was just the man who held the fence posts. Abby was the one who made the dirt worth holding on to." The screen door creaked open and Noah stepped out. He was dressed in a small version of his father's vest, his hair slicked back with water. He carried a small velvet cushion, but instead of a ring, he was holding the small, locked tin box. "Is it time, Dad?" Noah asked, his voice clear and bright as a mountain stream. "It's time, son." Abby stepped out onto the porch a moment later. She wasn't wearing white silk or a veil. She wore a simple cream-colored cotton dress with delicate lace at the collar, the dress she had sewn herself in the quiet evenings by the fire. She carried a bouquet of wild lavender and sage, the scent of the land trailing behind her. The ceremony was short, presided over by the local circuit rider who had known the Vance family for 40 years. There were no long speeches, only the quiet, steady vows of two people who had already survived the worst the world could throw at them. When it came time for the rings, Caleb took Abby's hand. He didn't pull a gold band from his pocket. Instead, he looked at Noah, who opened the tin box. Inside lay 2 silver coins. The first was the 1807 half sovereign, the one Caleb had left as a boy and Abby had kept as a woman. It was worn thin, the edges smooth from years of being touched in the dark. The second was a new coin minted in 1812, the year they had finally found their way back to each other. Caleb had found it in the shop during their last trip to the city, a twin to the first, representing the man he had become.
"I gave you the first one when I had nothing but a debt," Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion. "I give you the second one now as a promise. A promise that as long as this ranch stands and as long as there is breath in my body, you will never have to wonder if you have a home."
Abby took the 1812 coin, her fingers brushing his. "And I keep them both," she whispered. "One for the boy I loved and one for the man I chose." They didn't need a crowd to cheer. The wind over the plains provided the music, and the lowing of the cattle provided the chorus. As Caleb leaned down to kiss his wife, Noah squeezed between them, hugging their knees. "We're a real family now, right?" the boy asked, looking up at them. Caleb picked Noah up, settling him on his hip, and wrapped his other arm around Abby. The realest there ever was Noah. The afternoon faded into a warm, golden evening. Neighbors from the surrounding ranches stopped by with pies and casseroles, and for the first time in a generation, the Vance porch was crowded with friends. Even the local sheriff stopped by to mention that Mrs. Farley had officially moved to the city, her reputation in Oak Haven ruined beyond repair. The land was safe. The heritage was secure. Late that night, after Noah had been tucked into bed and the last of the guests had gone home, Caleb and Abby sat on the porch steps together. The moon was a sliver of silver over the ridge, casting a soft glow over the corrals. Caleb pulled the 2 coins from his pocket, letting them clink together in his palm. 7 years, he murmured. "I spent 7 years thinking this land was my prison, thinking I had to work myself into the grave just to prove I wasn't that stable boy anymore." Abby leaned her head against his shoulder, her hand resting on his knee. "You were never just a stable boy to me, Caleb. You were the man who knew how to listen to the horses. You were the man who knew that some things are worth waiting for." She looked at the house behind them, the windows glowing with lamplight, the kitchen smelling of blackberry cobbler and lavender. The ranch didn't need a master, Caleb. It needed a family. It needed to know that the people inside loved each other as much as they loved the soil. Caleb closed his hand over the coins and slipped them into his pocket. He stood up, offering his hand to Abby.
"Come inside, Mrs. Vance," he said, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "The wind is picking up and the hearth is warm."
They walked into the house together, the screen door clicking shut behind them. Outside, the Montana sky stretched out forever, vast and unforgiving. But inside the farmhouse, the silence was finally gone. The promise of the land had been kept, and in the small, locked tin box on the mantel, 2 silver coins sat side by side, a reminder that even after the deepest winter, the spring always finds its way back to the ranch.